The pinin came down from the canyon by Boro in October, £40 to the bundle, 2 bundles per trip, 2 trips a day when the upper trail was dry, and 1 trip when the frost had made the switchbacks slick. Miguel made 14 trips over 3 weeks after the corn harvest was in, cutting the pinin on the south-facing slope above the canyon's second bend, where the trees grew dense and resinous from the elevation and the long afternoon sun. He stacked it against the south wall of the adobe house in the standard fashion. Parallel rows elevated onto cedar rails, bark side up, the pieces close enough to be stable and loose enough for air to pass between the splits. He built the stack 6 feet wide and 4 feet high and covered the top row with a board leant that he had used for this purpose every year since he was old enough to swing the bucksaw. He was 24 years old and had been cutting his mother's pinon since Esteban had let him take the barrow up the canyon alone for the first time at age 11. He stacked it the way Esteban had stacked it, and the way Esteban's father had stacked it before that. And the stack against the south adobe wall had been the holding's winter fuel supply for as long as anyone on the Montoya land had been burning pinin, which was longer than Miguel could account for. The problem with the stack was also as old as the stack. Pinin cut at 6,800 feet in October, with the first frost already on the canyon floor, did not dry the way pinin cut in July dried. The resin in October cut pinin at the elevation of the Sangre de Cristo foothills behaved differently than the resin in summer cut pinin. Cold thickened it. Below approximately 4 degrees, the resin in the grain of a split pinin piece became viscous enough to seal the cut surfaces against moisture migration. The resin closing the channels through which the wood's internal moisture would otherwise have moved outward toward the surface and evaporated. Pinin green wood in the exterior November cold. The moisture was in the grain, the resin was over the grain, and the two conditions reinforced each other. The outdoor stack in January at the Sangre de Cristo foothills was approximately the same moisture content as the outdoor stack in October. The resin had locked the moisture in, and the cold had locked the resin. Burning this wood produced a fire that burned slowly and with reluctance. The steam from the locked moisture-consuming heat that should have gone into warming the kitchen. The room came to temperature late. The ceiling above the stove darkened through the winter with the incompletely combusted resin deposits from the green pinin's uneven burn. This was the condition of every holding at the Taos Valley elevation in winter. Green pinin, poor fire, dark ceiling, a stove that ran all day and still left the kitchen cold at 6 in the morning. Esteban Montoya had died of fever in November of 1876. The same month, the first snow came down from the range, and Rosalia had burned green pinin alone that winter for the first time. And the winter after Esteban's death was no worse in any measurable way than the 23 winters before it, except that she burned the wood alone. She was 47 years old. The holding was 12 acres on the lower slope of the Sangre de Cristo range, the main adobe house on 3 sides, with thick earthen walls that her husband's grandfather had built, and on the south side a frame addition that Esteban had added in 1868 with a raised board floor on fieldstone piers and a kitchen stove and room enough for the beds and the table together. The frame addition's floor sat 22 inches above the ground on the fieldstone piers, the space under the floor between the ground and the underside of the floor. Joists was open on all 4 sides to the outside air. It had always been open. It had held nothing. It was the unused space under the room above, receiving wind from the north in winter and baking in the afternoon sun in July, and no one had thought of a use for it in the 9 years since Esteban had built the addition. Rosalia began thinking about it in the first winter after Esteban died, and in March of 1877 she measured its temperature with the mercury thermometer she kept for the household's medical needs. She went under the addition on her hands and knees. 22 inches was low but passable, with the thermometer held out in front of her. Outside temperature, 23 degrees Fahrenheit. Under the sleeping area of the addition, over the fieldstone pier nearest the north wall, 37 degrees. Under the kitchen area, directly below the stove above, 43 degrees. She came out from under the addition and stood up and looked at the thermometer for a moment. 20 degrees warmer than the outside under the kitchen floor. 14 degrees warmer under the sleeping floor. The warmth was the stove's warmth, conducted downward through the floorboards and the floor joists and into the enclosed space below. It went through the floor and into the ground and was lost. It had always done this, and no one had used it for anything because the space was open to the outside on all 4 sides, and the wind came. through it and made any benefit from the floor warmth difficult to retain. If the sides were closed, a skirting board around all 4 sides, the warmth from the floor would accumulate in the enclosed subfloor space instead of being dispersed by the wind, and the space would hold something closer to the 43 degrees she had measured in the Pester's still air under the kitchen floor. The knowledge that made the temperature measurement useful, rather than merely interesting, came from her father, Don Sebastián Chávez, who had been a trader and traveler in the Taos Valley since before the American period, and who had described to Rosalía in her girlhood something he had observed at the Taos Pueblo on a trading visit in the 1840s. The kivas of the Pueblo, the round ceremonial rooms built partially below the ground, maintained a stable intermediate temperature throughout the year, not as cold as the exterior, not as warm as the heated interior, but a third condition between the two. The Pueblo families used the antechambers and transitional spaces adjacent to the kivas for storage of seed corn and dried provisions through the winter, because those spaces never froze and never became warm enough to spoil the stored goods. Don Sebastián had described this as a principle of the Pueblo architecture worth understanding. The intermediate space that existed between inside and outside, which was always moderated by both and extremed by neither. Rosalía had remembered this for 30 years as an observation about the Pueblo's earthen construction. She connected it in March of 1877 to the space under the frame addition's floor. The pin in question followed from the connection. If the subfloor space was enclosed and maintained 43 degrees under the kitchen floor in January, which she estimated it would, with the stove running harder in January than in March and the skirting retaining the warmth than green pinin stored, in that space would be in a temperature above 4 degrees Celsius through the entire winter. Above 4 degrees, pinin resin remained semi-liquid, not thin enough to bead from cut surfaces the way it did in July heat, but fluid enough that the resin did not seal the grain completely. With the resin semi-liquid, the moisture in the grain could migrate through the wood toward the cut surfaces. At the cut surfaces, in the ventilated space above the ground, the moisture could evaporate. The wood would dry, not quickly, not to 15% by December, which was the ideal moisture content for efficient burning, but from 50% in October to 25% by March was achievable in a space that held 40 degrees and moved air through the stored wood continuously. 25% moisture content burned at 80% efficiency. 50% moisture content burned at 30% efficiency. The difference was not marginal. It was the difference between a kitchen that came to temperature in 20 minutes and a kitchen that never properly warmed. She built the skirting in September of 1877, before Miguel brought the October pinin down from the canyon. 4 sides of board and batten nailed to the pier faces, the boards running from the ground up to the bottom of the sill plate. She left 2 specific openings in the skirting that were not structural oversights but the designed ventilation path for the system. At the top of the south skirting face, a gap of 2 inches running the full 14-foot width between the top board of the skirting and the floor framing above. This gap was positioned at the highest point of the enclosed subfloor space. Warm air rising from the floor, warmth above would collect at the top of the enclosed space and exit through this gap. The gap faced south, away from the prevailing north wind. At the bottom of the north skirting face, a gap of 1 inch at ground level, running the full 14-foot width. This gap was at the lowest point on the windward side. The cool, dry outside air that settled against the north face at ground level would enter through this gap and move south across the subfloor space, picking up moisture from the wood surfaces as it went and warming as it approached the floor above the kitchen. The convective path this produced was slow and consistent. Cool, dry air entered north low, warmed as it crossed the subfloor space toward the south, picked up the moisture that the above freezing temperature had enabled the wood to release, and exited south high as warmer and moister air. The wood dried from the north face to the south. The wood nearest the south exit dried fastest because the outgoing air was at its maximum moisture carrying capacity as it reached the south gap, and the wood nearest the exit was in the direct path of this outgoing airflow. She divided the subfloor space into 2 zones at the midpoint of the east-west dimension, marked by a cedar rail running the full north-south depth of the space zone. A occupied the south half of the subfloor space, below the kitchen floor, where the stove above provided the most warmth. Zone a temperature in January with the stove running, 43 to 46 degrees Fahrenheit. This was the zone for the burnwood. The the wood that would be retrieved through the current winter for the kitchen stove. She loaded Zone A in late September with the pinnon from the previous spring's cutting that had been sitting in the outdoor stack since April and had reached approximately 25% moisture over the outdoor summer. Not ideal, but substantially better than green October wood. Zone B occupied the north half, below the sleeping area floor, where the stove's warmth was less direct. Zone B temperature, in January 35 to 39 degrees Fahrenheit, still above the 4-degree threshold for resin fluidity, but cooler than Zone A. This was the zone for the drying wood, the fresh green pinnon that Miguel brought down in October. She loaded Zone B as he brought the loads down, stacking the green pieces on cedar rails elevated 2 inches from the ground to allow air circulation below the bottom course. The October pinnon went into Zone B at 50% moisture and would stay there, untouched, until the spring. The 2 access panels she built into the south face of the skirting were 18 by 20 inches each, hinged to swing outward on strap hinges with a wooden turn button for closure. The east panel gave access to Zone A. The west panel gave access to Zone B. She labeled both panels with a wood-burned mark, a letter A and a letter B, so that anyone who opened the wrong panel by mistake would see the label before disturbing the wrong zone's wood. The floor trapdoor she cut in the kitchen floor directly above Zone A, 14 by 14 inches, hinged flush with 2 small strap hinges recessed into the floor surface so the trapdoor lay flat when closed. She countersunk the iron ring pull so it sat flush with the board surface. The trapdoor was for daily retrieval, in January at 6 in the morning, when the outside temperature was 10 degrees, and going to the south access panel meant opening the exterior door into the dark cold. The trapdoor allowed her to reach down from inside the warm kitchen and pull up the day's wood without going outside. This was the feature she had thought about most carefully and was most satisfied with. The wood came up through the floor, the same direction the heat went down. She loaded the system in the last week of September 1877. Zone A received the prior spring's outdoor dried pinnons stacked in rows on the cedar rails, bark side down to maximize the exposed cut surface area, facing the south exit airflow. Zone B received the October green pinnon as Miguel brought it down, stacked in the same orientation. She closed both south panels. She closed the trapdoor. She looked at the kitchen floor. The trapdoor was visible. She had not attempted to disguise it, but it lay flat and the countersunk ring pull did not catch the eye. A visitor looking at the kitchen floor saw a flaw. The discipline of the system had one absolute rule, which she had thought through before she built it and which she explained to Miguel when he helped load Zone B. Zone B was not to be opened between October and March. The Zone B would needed its full winter in the above freezing temperature to dry from 50% to 25%. Opening the west panel and taking wood from Zone B before March broke the drying cycle in progress. The wood in Zone B was not fuel, it was next winter's fuel in preparation. It was being made into fuel. Taking it before it was made defeated the system. Miguel said, "What if Zone A runs out before March?" She said, "Zone A should not run out before March. I loaded it with enough for the season." He said, "But if it does," she said, "if it does, we add wood to Zone A from the outdoor stack. The wood that has been on the outdoor stack since spring will be partially dried and is better than the green October wood. We do not open Zone B." He understood the reasoning and agreed to it. The first winter of the system, 1877-78, was the transitional year. Zone A burned through the winter at 25% moisture, which was better than the green October pinnon her neighbors burned, but still not the clean, efficient burn she was working toward. The fire started reliably. The room came to temperature in a reasonable time. The stovepipe accumulated less deposit than in prior years. She finished Zone A in the 3rd week of February, with enough of the winter remaining to require 1 supplemental load from the outdoor stack, which was as she had planned. In March of 1878, she opened the west panel and examined the Zone B wood. She pressed her thumbnail into the end grain of a piece from the back of the north stack, the piece that had been in the coolest, least dried position of Zone B through the entire winter. The wood gave slightly under her nail, not hard and dry, but noticeably firmer than the October piece she had set aside outdoors as a comparison sample. She weighed a Zone B piece against the outdoor comparison piece of the same dimensions. The Zone B piece was lighter. The outdoor comparison piece had not dried. The exterior cold had held the resin solid, and the moisture had stayed locked in the grain. The Zone B piece had dried, the subfloor temperature had kept the resin semi-fluid, and the moisture had moved and evaporated through the south gap over 5 months of continuous ventilation. She moved all the Zone B wood to Zone A position, south half, on the rails, bark side down, oriented toward the south exit gap. Then she loaded the North Zone B position with the spring-cut green pinnon that Miguel brought down in April when the Upper Canyon Trail was clear. Fresh green wood at 50% into Zone B. The moved Zone B wood, now at 25%, settled into Zone A for the summer. The kitchen floor above Zone A conducted warmth down through the spring and summer months, less warmth than in winter. The stove not burning at full capacity, but enough to continue the drying process. By September, the Zone A wood was at 12 to 15% moisture. The winter of 1878 to 79 was the first winter the system worked at full performance. The Zone A would at 12 to 15% moisture burned with the clean, fragrant efficiency of July pinene, the wood cut in summer that the Taos Valley families burned when they were fortunate enough to have cut it in time. The fire started on the first match. The kitchen reached temperature in 20 minutes. The stovepipe stayed clean through November, through December, through the hard cold of January. She used 1 armload less per day than she had used the previous winter, and the kitchen was warmer. She counted the armloads carefully in both winters to be certain the comparison was accurate. It was accurate. Perfecta Salazar came in February of 1879 to return a pot she had borrowed before the December snow. She came into the kitchen and stood by the stove and felt the immediate warmth of the clean burning pinnon fire and said, without any other preamble, "Your pinnon is burning like July pinnon." In February, how? Rosalia was at the table, and she looked at the fire, and then at Perfecta. She said, "Come and see." She opened the floor trapdoor and lifted out a piece of the Zone A wood, pale, split face, dry grain, clean and firm. She handed it to Perfecta. Perfecta pressed her thumbnail into the end grain. "Nothing gave," she said. "This is as dry as summer wood." Rosalia said, "It has been drying since October." Perfecta said, "Outside the stack looked green." Rosalia said, "The stack outside is next winter's wood." She took Perfecta around to the south side of the frame addition and opened the east panel Zone A, now nearly depleted, showing the last 2 rows of pale dry pinnon on the rails. She opened the west panel Zone B, the current winter's green October pinnon, which would not be touched until March. She explained the zones, the cedar rail divider, the 2 panels, the north bottom gap and the south top gap, the direction of the air's convective path from north to south. She explained the floor, trapdoor, and the daily retrieval without going outside. She explained the March rotation, move Zone B to Zone A position, load new green wood into Zone B, close both panels. "Wait," Perfecta said, "the floor is warm." It was making the wood dry. Rosalia said, "The floor has always been warm. I only needed to understand what the warmth going downward was doing." Perfecta said nothing for a moment. Then she said, "How long did you know about this before you built it?" Rosalia said, "I knew part of it for 30 years. My father told me about the Pueblo antechamber. I did not know the rest until I put the thermometer under the floor and measured the temperature myself." Perfecta built a similar system under the frame addition of her own house in April of 1879. Her crawl space was 18 inches lower than Rosalia S22, and she adapted the stacking method accordingly, using smaller splits and a lower single rail rather than the double rail system. She built the same north-low-south high ventilation. She built the same 2 zones with the 2 panels. She asked Rosalia only one question during the construction: how close to the south gap should the Zone A stack be positioned? Rosalia said, "Close enough that the outgoing air passes over the cut faces of the top course. The top course of each row should be within 6 inches of the south gap." Perfecta positioned the stack accordingly. By the winter of 1882-81, 4 of the 7 frame addition houses in the valley settlement above Taos were burning under floor-dried pinnon through the winter. The women who built those systems called it the Montoya method, which was Rosalia's married name and the name it kept in the settlement afterward. The construction details varied between the 4 houses: crawl space, height, rail configuration, panel placement, because each woman adapted the system to the specific dimensions of her own underfloor space. The principle did not vary. The principle was what Rosalia had derived from Don Sebastian's description of the Pueblo antechambers and from the mercury thermometer reading in March of 1877. The floor was always warm above the space. She had only needed to understand that the warmth going down from the floor was not waste. It was work being done on the wood that would come up through the floor in February. The physics of what happened to green pinene in the subfloor space, and why the same pinene in the outdoor stack did not experience the same drying, requires a specific explanation. Because the mechanism depended on properties of pinene resin that distinguished it from the hardwood species in the firewood storage systems of the eastern and northern states covered in other accounts in this series. Pinene pine, Pinus idalis, grows at elevations between 6,000 and 8,000 feet across the New Mexico and Colorado Plateau country. The tree's high resin content, substantially higher than most eastern pines and dramatically higher than hardwoods like oak, hickory, and ash, is the source of both its value as fuel and its storage difficulty. When properly dried, pinene burns at high heat output per cord because the resin itself is combustible, adding its energy to the cellulose combustion. The familiar fragrance of a pinene fire is the resin's aromatic compounds burning. Properly dried pinene at 15% moisture content releases approximately 21 million BTU per cord, comparable to oak or hickory, despite pinene's lower density. Green pinene at 50% moisture content releases approximately 12 million BTU per cord, with much of that heat going to steam conversion. The efficiency loss is not merely from the water, it is from the interaction between the water and the resin. Green pinene's resin is water-saturated. The same moisture that the drying process needs to remove from the wood is also present in the resin channels. And when the wood is burned green, the resin-water combination produces the acrid black smoke and the stovepipe deposits that are the characteristic problem of green pinene burning. The resin's temperature sensitivity was the specific property that made outdoor winter storage counterproductive for pinene specifically. In eastern hardwoods, oak, hickory, the ash species common to the northern and mid-Atlantic states, the cellular structure that holds water is not resin-sealed in the same way. An oak split at 50% moisture in October, placed in a sheltered outdoor stack with good airflow, will continue to dry through the winter at a reduced rate. BECAUSE, water migration through the oak cellular structure is not blocked by a temperature-sensitive sealant. Outdoor oak drying in winter is slower than summer drying, but not zero. Outdoor pinene drying in winter at Sangre de Cristo elevations is effectively zero, because below 4 degrees Celsius the resin viscosity increases to the point where the resin acts as a physical barrier across the grain channels through which moisture would otherwise migrate. The moisture is present in the grain. The resin over the grain is solid. The moisture cannot reach the cut surfaces. The cut surface drying that is the primary mechanism of wood moisture loss does not occur. The pinene that was 50% moisture in October is 48% moisture in January, not because the cold slows drying, but because the cold prevents drying entirely. The subfloor space at 43 degrees Fahrenheit, 6 degrees Celsius, was above the resin fluidity threshold. At 6 degrees pinene resin does not bead from cut surfaces as it does in summer, but it does not seal the grain channels either. It remains in a state of moderate viscosity that allows moisture migration to proceed through the grain at a reduced rate. The rate is slower than summer drying at 25 degrees Celsius, but it is not zero. 5 months of not zero drying from October to March, in a space with continuous ventilated airflow, produced the 25% moisture content that Rosalia found when she opened the west panel in March of 1878, and pressed her thumbnail into the Zone B wood. The eastern underfloor firewood systems documented in this series, the Connecticut Emergency Reserve, the Rhode Island Primary Storage, did not need to account for this resin mechanism, because the wood species in those systems were primarily oak, hickory, and maple, whose drying is not blocked by resin sealing in winter temperatures. Those systems solved different problems. The Connecticut system solved access in a blizzard. The Rhode Island system solved re-wetting and concealment. The New Mexico system solved a wood chemistry problem that was specific to the resinous species of the high-altitude Southwest. This is why Rosalia's system could not have been derived from the accounts of the eastern systems, and why the eastern systems, applied unchanged to a pinene-burning household in the Sangre de Cristo foothills, would have produced only marginal improvement. The temperature threshold was the crucial element. The 43 degrees subfloor temperature under the kitchen floor was not arbitrary. It was specifically above the pinene resin fluidity threshold. A subfloor space that held 32 degrees would have provided some protection from precipitation but no improvement in drying. Because 32 degrees is below the resin threshold. The system worked because the stove above was large enough and busy enough to push the kitchen zone above 40 degrees even on the coldest January nights. The construction of the skirting and the two-zone interior organization reflected Rosalia's assessment of what the system needed to do and what it needed to not do. And the distinction between these two things was as important to the system's design as the ventilation path or the zone divider. What the system needed to do: provide a continuously ventilated above freezing space under the kitchen floor, divided into a drying zone and a burn zone, with access to each zone that did not compromise the other zone's function. What the system needed to not do: allow the zone B wood to be accessed for burning before it had completed its winter drying period. The second requirement was behavioral rather than structural, but it had a structural component. The two separate panels on the south skirting face, labeled A and B, made the distinction between the two zones physically present in the system. A single access panel covering the full width of the south face would have made it possible, even likely, on a cold morning, to reach for the nearest available piece, rather than observing the zone discipline. The two-panel design made the distinction unavoidable. To take wood, you opened one panel or the other, and the panel you opened determined what you were doing and whether it was correct. Rosalia had thought about this problem specifically because she had seen how fatigue and cold worked against careful procedures. At 6 in the morning in January, when the fire was out and the kitchen was cold and the wood box was empty, the decision-making capacity that supported the zone discipline was reduced by the conditions it needed to operate in. The trapdoor solved the morning cold problem. The daily retrieval happened inside, without opening the exterior door, but it did not solve the zone discipline problem for the rare days when Zone A was depleted and something had to be brought in from outside. Her solution, Zone A, was large enough to hold the full season's supply with a margin of one additional load. She calculated the season's consumption from the prior 3 winters' usage, estimated the volume of wood that calculation represented, and sized Zone A to hold that volume plus 20%. This meant that a winter with significantly higher consumption than average could still be served from Zone A without touching Zone B. Only an extraordinary winter, sustained cold beyond anything in her memory of the Sangre de Cristo foothills, would require going to the outdoor stack for supplemental wood. She had explained this to Miguel, and he had understood the logic. The cedar rail divider that separated Zone A from Zone B was a physical marker only, not a barrier. A piece of Zone B could have been moved to Zone A simply by stepping over the cedar rail. The discipline was not architectural, but the rail made the zones visible, and the panel labeling made the distinction explicit. Rosalia's assumption was that a person who understood what the system was doing, who knew why Zone B needed to remain undisturbed, would not violate the discipline. She explained the system to Miguel and to Perfecta in enough detail that both understood the reason behind the zone separation, not just the rule. Understanding the reason made the rule easier to follow, because the rule was not arbitrary. The March rotation was the annual reset of the system, and the moment at which the previous year's discipline was either validated or revealed as insufficient. In March of each year, Rosalia opened both panels and examined the Zone B wood before deciding to rotate. The examination had 2 components. She pressed her thumbnail into the end grain of a piece from the coolest, least dried position in Zone B, the back of the north stack, and she compared the weight of a Zone B piece to the weight of a same-size piece from the outdoor comparison stack she maintained for this purpose. If the Zone B piece was harder under her thumbnail and lighter in her hand than the outdoor comparison piece, the drying had worked and the rotation could proceed. If the Zone B piece showed no improvement over the outdoor piece, something had failed in the system, the ventilation, the temperature, the zone discipline, and she needed to understand why before proceeding. In March of 1878, the first examination showed improvement. The Zone B wood was firmer and lighter than the outdoor comparison. In March of 1879, after the full performance winter with the 15% Zone A wood, the Zone B examination showed the same improvement at the same level. The system was performing consistently. The rotation itself took half a day, moving the Zone B wood from the north half to the south half, positioning it on the rails with the cut faces oriented toward the south exit gap. then loading the newly empty North Zone B position with the spring-cut green pinnon that Miguel brought down in April. The Zone B would move to Zone A, would spend the summer and autumn in the warmer South Zone, where the kitchen floor above conducted warmth even in the warm months at 6,800 feet, and by September the moved wood was at 12 to 15%, the level that would produce the clean, efficient jalapeno burn through the coming winter. The rotation was also the moment at which the self-renewing character of the system was most visible. The system did not require a new decision each year. It required a consistent procedure. Load Zone B in October, burn Zone A through the winter, rotate in March, load new Zone B in April. The procedure repeated annually, with no modification required unless the crawlspace temperature, the wood species, or the season's consumption changed significantly. It was not a solution to a specific winter. It was a persistent system that transformed green October pinnon into well-dried winter fuel as a continuous background process, using the floor warmth that had always been there and the ventilation path that the skirting and the two gaps created. Rosalia had understood from the beginning that the system's value was not in what it produced in one winter, but in what it produced in every winter after the first. The first winter was transitional, better than before but not yet at full performance. The second winter was where the system paid for its construction, 12 to 15% pinene, clean fire, warm kitchen, no stovepipe deposits. The third winter was the same. Each subsequent winter was the same. The construction cost, the skirting boards, the cedar rails, the two strap-hinge panels, the trapdoor hardware was paid back in the first good winter and continued paying back for every winter the system operated. This amortization was not how Rosalia thought about it. She did not calculate the return on the skirting boards against the fuel savings. She thought about it the way Dan Sebastian had described the Pueblo antechamber, a persistent condition that maintained useful properties through the winter without requiring renewal. The Pueblo families had not rebuilt their antechambers each year. The antechambers were there, and the antechambers worked, and the corn stayed above, freezing in them, and the corn was viable in spring. Rosalia's subfloor space was there, and the subfloor space worked, and the pinon dried in it, and the pinon burned cleanly through the winter. The system was not a seasonal intervention. It was a permanent condition of the frame addition. The comparison between Rosalia's system and the other underfloor Firewood storage systems in this series reveals why the problem being solved determines the mechanism required, and why the same physical space, a crawl space under a raised frame floor, can be used to solve fundamentally different problems through fundamentally different designs. Prudence Alcott's Connecticut underfloor reserve was a problem of access. She had dry wood in outdoor storage and needed to reach it when the blizzard buried the outdoor supply under 4 feet of snow. Her system used the subfloor space to hold a one-cord emergency reserve that was accessible through a floor trapdoor, regardless of exterior snow conditions. The wood she stored in the Connecticut subfloor was already dry. It did not need to be dried there. The subfloor space was a location for pre-dried wood, not a drying environment. Its value was in where it was and how it could be reached, not in what it did to the wood inside it. Abigail Marsh's Rhode Island undercabin woodshed was a problem of community perception and weather protection. She had a visible from outside woodpile that marked her as needing assistance, and she had a lean-to that had collapsed. Her system used the subfloor space to hold the full season's wood supply invisibly, with die-slot boards that were indistinguishable from the fixed skirting and an interior that protected dry wood from re-wetting. The wood she stored in the Rhode Island subfloor was also already dry, spring-cut and summer-dried before being loaded in October. The subfloor space was a protected location for pre-dried wood, with the invisibility being the primary innovation. Neither the Connecticut nor the Rhode Island system used the subfloor space as a drying environment. The space in those cases was a place to put dry wood. The subfloor space in the New Mexico system was a place to make dry wood, a drying environment that turned green October pinning into 12% moisture fuel over 12 months, using the stove's waste heat and the convective ventilation as the active drying mechanism. This distinction, storage location versus drying environment, was the specific innovation in Rosalia's system that earned the description her neighbors used for it: smart storage. The Connecticut and Rhode Island systems were smart in the sense of clever and well-designed. The New Mexico system was smart in the additional sense of active. It did something to the wood, not merely for the wood. It transformed the wood's condition over time. The wood that went in at 50% moisture was different wood, in a meaningful way. When it came out at 12% moisture, not the same wood in better maintained condition, but chemically and physically transformed wood that had shed more than half its original moisture content, through a directed process that the design of the space made possible. That process was what Rosalia had understood when she put the thermometer under the kitchen floor in March of 1877 and found 43 degrees Fahrenheit. Not just that the space was warmer than outside, but that the warmth had a specific application to the specific problem of October pinnin at 6,800 feet. The warmth was above the pinnin resin threshold. The resin threshold was the obstacle that made outdoor winter storage of pinnin useless. The subfloor warmth removed that obstacle continuously, every day of the winter. For every piece of wood in Zone B, without requiring any action from her, after the October loading was complete, she had built the system once. The system worked every winter after that. The spread of the Montoya method through the valley settlement, above Taos, and the specific way Rosalia transmitted it to the 4 women who built their own versions between 1879 and 1882, reflected a transmission pattern that differed from the spread of the other firewood storage systems documented in this series. Because the transmission in this case was constrained by a prerequisite that the other systems did not require, the Connecticut and Rhode Island systems could be built by anyone with a raised frame floor and the necessary materials. The critical elements: a floor, trapdoor, a skirting with a 2-inch ventilation gap, dado slot access boards were carpentry problems that any experienced carpenter could execute given a description. The understanding required was mechanical: how to cut a trapdoor, how to fit dado slot boards so they slide in and out without binding, how to build a skirting that is weathertight, except at the intended ventilation gap. A person who understood carpentry and read a careful description of either the Connecticut or Rhode Island system could replicate it without having seen the original. The New Mexico system required an additional understanding that was not carpentry. Why 43 degrees Fahrenheit was the important temperature, why Zone B could not be opened before March, why the north bottom south top ventilation path was in that specific direction rather than any other, and why the system produced better results in the second winter than the first. A person who understood only the mechanical construction, skirting, rails, 2 panels, trapdoor, and built it faithfully would produce a functioning system. But a person who understood only the construction without understanding the pinnin resin threshold and the drying mechanism would not know what to do if the system failed to produce expected results, and would not know whether a variation in their specific crawlspace dimensions required a compensating adjustment to the rail height or the ventilation gap width. Rosalia explained the pinnin resin mechanism to each woman she taught, because she had understood from the beginning that the system's discipline, specifically the Zone B non-disturbance rule, could only be maintained by someone who understood why it mattered. The discipline was not arbitrary caution. It was the specific behavioral requirement that kept the drying process intact. If a woman built the system but did not understand why Zone B needed its full winter undisturbed, she would make the rational decision in a cold February morning to open the west panel and take the nearest available piece, rather than going to the outdoor stack for supplemental wood. That rational decision would reduce Zone B's drying time by the remaining weeks of winter and produce Zone A with the following year that was 25% rather than 12%, the difference between a good fire and an excellent fire. Less dramatic than the difference between green wood and well-dried wood. But real perfecter understood the mechanism clearly and built her system accordingly. The 2 women who built their systems in 1880 and 1881 also received the same explanation, and both of them maintained the zone discipline through their first winter. The 4th woman, Filomena Ortega, who built her system in 1882, asked a question that none of the others had asked. What if the pinnin is cut in July instead of October? Could it go directly into Zone A without spending a winter in Zone B first? Rosalia considered this. July cut pinnin had spent the summer heat liquefying its resin rather than solidifying it, and the cut faces were open to moisture migration from the first day of cutting rather than sealed by October cold. July cut pinnin dried outdoors over the summer to approximately 20% moisture by October already, better than October cut green wood. In Zone A through the winter, July cut pinnin at 20% would continue drying in the 43-degree warmth, potentially reaching 12 to 15% by February. She told Filomena, if you have July cut pinnin, and you have space in Zone A. Put it in Zone A, it will be at 15% by winter. But most years, the July cutting is small, the men cannot make the canyon trip until the summer work is done. And there is not time for more than 1 or 2 loads before the autumn harvest begins. The October cutting is the main supply because October is when the time is available. The system is built for October pining because that is what there is. Philomena's question was the most technically sophisticated question anyone had asked about the system, and it was the question that told Rosalia that Philomena had understood the mechanism, not merely the procedure. The procedure could be followed by anyone who heard the instructions. The mechanism could be reasoned about, which was a different and more useful kind of understanding. The thermometer, reading in March of 1877, the measurement that was the practical starting point of the entire system, was an action that required a decision Rosalia had not explicitly recognized as unusual until Perfecta asked her about it. Perfecta said, on the afternoon they stood at the south, skirting, examining the 2 access panels. When did you first think about measuring the temperature under the floor? Rosalia said, the first winter after Esteban died. I was burning the wood alone, and I was thinking about whether there was a way to burn it better. Perfecta said, but why did you measure it? Most people would have put their hand under the floor and felt whether it was warm. You put a thermometer. Rosalia thought about this for a moment. She said, a hand tells you warm or cold. A thermometer tells you 43 degrees. I needed to know whether the temperature was above 4 degrees Celsius, the resin threshold, and I could not determine that from a hand. The hand would have told me it was warmer than outside, and I would have noted that without knowing whether it was warm enough. The thermometer told me the specific temperature, and I knew whether that temperature was sufficient for the purpose. Perfecta said, how did you know about the resin threshold? Rosalia said, I had been burning pinnin for 23 years. I had observed that pinnin from the outdoor stack in July burned differently than pinnin from the same stack in January. Same tree, same cutting, different behavior in the fire. I had attributed this to the summer heat affecting the resin. The July fire told me that the resin in summer was different from the resin in winter. The thermometer told me that 43 degrees was the temperature under my kitchen floor. I connected those 2 observations and concluded that 43 degrees was warm enough to make the underfloor pinnin behave like summer pinnin rather than winter pinnin. Perfecta was quiet for a moment. Then she said, you did not know for certain that it would work until you tried it, Rosalia said. No. I had good reason to believe it would work, but until March of 1878, when I opened the west panel and pressed my thumbnail into the Zone B wood and found it had dried, I did not know for certain. Perfecta said, and if it had not dried, Rosalia said, then I would have thought about why it had not, and tried to understand what I had estimated incorrectly. This was the complete account of how Rosalia had known what she knew and done what she had done with it. 23 years of observation. A description from her father that she had held for 30 years, a thermometer reading in March, and a connection between the thermometer reading and the previous 30 years' accumulation, then a construction, and then a test, and then an adjustment of the construction based on the test results, and then another winter, and then the validation that the adjustment had been correct. It was not a sudden insight. It was not a revelation. It was the patient application of observations collected over a life to a problem that had always been present and had never been solved. In the specific winter, when the absence of any other person to whom the problem could be referred made solving it herself the only available option, Esteban had always managed the wood. Esteban had always stacked it against the south wall and burned it green through the winter and accepted the dark ceiling and the slow morning fire as the conditions of burning pinin at 6,800 feet in October. He had managed it capably and had not thought about it otherwise. Rosalia had burned the same wood in the same stack and had thought about it differently in the winter after he died. Not because she had become more capable in his absence, but because the problem had become fully hers to think about, and she had 23 years of observations about pinnin resin ready to apply to it. The floor was always warm. It had been warm under Esteban's floor and warm under his father's floor and warm under every raised frame floor in the Taos Valley settlement that had a kitchen stove. The warmth had gone into the ground every winter for every year those floors had existed. In the winter of 1877 to 78, it went into the pinnin in Zone B instead, and in the winter of 1878 to 79, the pinnin that had been in Zone B came up. through the trapdoor in Zone A, and burned with the clean, fragrant heat of July pinnin in February. And the kitchen was warm by the time the sun came over the Sangre de Cristo range. The Valley settlement kept no formal record of the Montoya method spread. What it kept was the practice itself, the two-panel skirting, the north bottom, south top ventilation, the Zone B non-disturbance through winter, the March rotation. By 1885, the method had reached holdings in the next valley east, through Perfecta Salazar's cousin, who had visited in January of 1882, and asked about the clean-burning fire. The cousin built her own version that spring. Her neighbor built one in 1883. The method traveled by the same mechanism as the pinnin itself, person to person, in the direction of the questions being asked. To whoever needed to know why the fire in February burned like the fire in July, she had built it once in September of 1877 at a cost of $3.40 for the skirting boards, the strap hinges, the cedar rails, and the trapdoor hardware. She had never had to build it again. The system renewed itself each March and delivered itself each October, and required from her only the discipline of the zone separation and the patience of the first transitional year. Everything after the first year was the same system working as it had been designed to work.